Chapter 11, Edward-1307, by Charles Oman. The confidence and admiration which the English nation felt for Prince Edward were well shown by the fact that he was proclaimed king on the day of his father's death without any form of election by the Parliament. This was the first time that the English crown was transferred by strict hereditary succession, and that the old traditions of the solemn choice by the Great Council were neglected. Edward was still absent in Palestine, but the government was carried on in his name without trouble or friction till he landed in England on August 2, 1274. It was 19 months since his father had died, yet nothing had gone amiss in the interval, so great was the belief of the English in the wisdom and justice of the coming king. Edward was probably the best and greatest ruler, save Alfred, that England has ever known. He was a most extraordinary contrast to his shifty father and his cruel, treacherous grandsire. His private life was a model to all men. Nothing could have shown a better conception of the respective claims of patriotism and of filial duty than his conduct during the Civil War. His court was grave and virtuous, and his faithful wife, Eleanor of Castile, was the object of his chivalrous devotion. Edward was religious without superstition, liberal without unthriftiness, resolute without obstinacy. But the most striking feature of his character was his love of good faith and justice. His favorite device was pactum serva, keep your promise, and in all his doings he strove to carry it out. It was this that made him such an admirable king for a country where constitutional liberty was just PG 149, beginning to develop itself. If he promised his parliament to abandon any custom or introduce any reform, he might be trusted honestly to do his best to adhere to his engagement. It must not be supposed that he never fell out with his subjects. His conceptions of the rights and duties of a king were so high that it was impossible for him to avoid collisions with Parliament. But when such collisions occurred, though he fought them out with firmness, yet, if beaten, he accepted his defeat without rancor. His justice was perhaps too severe. He could pardon on occasion, but he had a stern way of dealing with those whom he regarded as traitors or oath-breakers. The chief blots on his reign are instances of merciless severity to conquered rebels. Edward has been accused of having sometimes adhered too closely to the letter of the law when it told in his own favor, but there seems little reason to doubt that he was honestly following his own lights. Compared with any contemporary sovereign, he was a very mirror of justice and equity. In addition to showing great merits as administrator, Edward was notable both as a good soldier and a wise general. His tall and robust frame and dauntless courage made him one of the best knights of his day. Yet he was no mere fighting man, but a skilled tactician. He had long forgotten the reckless impulsiveness that lost the day at Lewes, and had become one of the best captains of his age. He deserves a prominent place in the history of the art of war for being the first who discovered the military value of the English longbowmen and turned them to good account in his battles. Hitherto English generals, like Continental, had been trusting entirely to the charge of their mailed cavalry. Edward, as we shall see at Falkirk, had learnt that the bowman was no less effective than the knight in the deciding of battles. The years of Edward's long and eventful reign are full of interest and importance both within and without the bounds of England. The history of his legislation and of the development of the power of Parliament under him deserve close observation no less than his successful dealings with Wales and his almost successful scheme for the conquest of Scotland. Nor can his relations with France be left without remark. His legislation, most of which falls into the earlier years of his PG 150 reign, requires the first notice. Throughout the whole of it, we trace a consistent purpose of strengthening the crown by restricting the rights both of the church and the baronage. His first collision with the church dates fro, when Archbishop Peckham made an attempt to reassert some of Becket's old doctrines as to the complete independence and wide scope of ecclesiastical jurisdiction. When Peckham summoned a national council of clergy at Reading in 1279 and issued certain canons in support of the independence of the church courts, Edward replied not merely by compelling him to withdraw the objectionable document, but by passing the celebrated Statute of Mortmain, or de religiosis, as it is sometimes called. This was a measure destined to prevent the further accumulation of estates in the dead hand, in mortua manu, of the Church. It was estimated that a fourth of the surface of England was already in the possession of the clerical body, and this land no longer paid its fair proportion of the taxes of the realm. For a large share of the king's revenue came from reliefs, or death duties, and escheats, or resumption of lands to which there was no heir. And as a monastery or bishopric never died, the king got neither reliefs nor escheats from them. The statute prevented any man from alienating his land to the monasteries, and specially forbade the fraudulent practice of making ostensible gifts to the church and receiving them back. For landholders had sometimes pretended to make over their estates to a monastery in order to escape the taxation due on feudal fiefs, while really, by a corrupt agreement with the monks, they kept the property in their own power and so enjoyed it tax-free. For the future, land rarely fell into the dead hand, since it could not be given away without the king's consent. Very few new monasteries were built or endowed after the passing of this statute, but the crown not unfrequently relaxed the rule in favor of the colleges in the universities, which were just now beginning to spring up. Edward's dealings with the baronage are even more important in the history of the English constitution than his contest with the clerical body. He showed a consistent purpose of defending the rights of the crown against the great feudal lords, and of bringing all holders of land into close dependence on himself. His first attempt of PG 151, the kind, was the issue of the writ quo warranto in 1278. This writ was a royal mandate ordering an inquiry by what warrant many of the old royal estates had come into private hands, for the king thought that much state property had passed illegally out of the possession of the crown, by the thriftlessness of his father and the disorder of the civil wars of 1260–65. This project for an inquiry into old rights and documents both vexed and frightened the baronage. They murmured loudly. The tale is well known how John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, when asked to produce the evidence of his right to certain lands, dashed down an old rusty sword before the commissioners, crying, "This is my title deed. My ancestors came over with King William and won their lands by the sword, and with this same sword I will maintain them against anyone who tries to take them from me." The whole baronage showed such a hostile feeling against Edward's proposal that he finally contented himself with making a complete list of the still remaining crown lands, but did not raise the question of the resumption of long-alienated estates. Another device of the king's for binding the landholders of the realm more closely to himself was his scheme for making knights of all persons who held estates worth more than £20 a year. His object was not so much to gain the fees due from those who received knighthood, as to bring all the middle class of landholders, who held under the great feudal lords, into closer relation with himself through the homage and oath which they made to him after receiving the honor, 1278. In subsequent legislation, Edward took care to conciliate the baronage by strengthening not only his rights over them, but their rights over their vassals. The most important of these was escheat, the right of resuming possession of land when its holder died without an heir. This right was always liable to be defeated by the tenant selling his land, and its value was yet more diminished if he could dispose of part of the land in such a way that the buyer became his own subtenant. A clause in Magna Charta had restricted this process, but the barons wished to limit even more their tenants' power of parting with land. On the other hand, as society became more industrial and less warlike, it became more desirable that land should pass freely from man to man. PG 152. These conflicting interests resulted in two enactments, which are landmarks in English history. The first, the Second Statute of Westminster, contains the famous clauses de donis conditionalibus. It forbade the alienation of land granted to a person and his actual lineal descendants, or to use a modern phrase, it made possible the creation of perpetual entails. The barons soon saw that it enabled them to settle their lands on their own families, and it was regularly employed for this purpose for about 200 years, till at last a legal fiction was invented which greatly cut down the power of tying up land. On the other hand, the Statute Quia Emptors, 1290, far from restricting the power of alienation, expressly allowed it in all cases not coming within the Statute de Donis. but at the same time it enacted that the purchaser, whether of the whole or part of an estate, should become the tenant, not of the seller, but of the seller's lord. In other words, it put an end to subinfeudation. This led, in the end, to the enormous multiplication of the lesser vassals of the crown, and tended to the ultimate extinction of all subtenancies, so that the king was the gainer in the long run, since whenever a great estate was broken up, he became the immediate lord of all those among whom it was dispersed. Besides the great statutes we have already named, several other items of King Edward's legislation demand a word of notice. The Statute of Winchester, 1285, reorganized the national militia, the descendant of the old feared, ordaining what arms each man, according to his rank and wealth, should furnish for himself. It also provided for the establishment of a watch or local police for the suppression of robbers and outlaws. But all the king's doings were not so wise. To his discredit must be named his intolerant edict for the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290. Edward seems to have picked up in his crusading days a blind horror of infidels of all sorts. He disliked the Jews, somewhat for being inveterate clippers and debasers of the coinage, more for being usurers at extortionate rates in days when usury was held to be a deadly sin, but most of all for the mere reason that they were not Christians. To his own great loss, for the taxes of the Jews were a considerable item in his revenues, he banished PG 153 them all from the land, giving them 3 months to sell their houses and realize their debts. It was 360 years before they were again allowed to return to the realm. The same years that are notable for the passing of the statutes of Mortmain and Quia Emptors, and for the expulsion of the Jews, were those in which the English Parliament was gradually growing into its permanent shape. We have already told how Simon de Montfort summoned in 1265 the first assembly, which corresponds to our modern idea of a parliament, by containing representatives from shires and boroughs, as well as a muster of the great barons and bishops who were tenants-in-chief of the crown. As it chanced, Edward did not call a great council in exactly that same form but in the intervening years he generally summoned knights of the shire to attend the deliberation of his lords, and consent to the granting of money. On 2 occasions in 1283, the cities and boroughs were also bidden to send their representatives, but these were not full parliaments, for at the first, held at Northampton, no barons were present, while at the second, which sat at Acton Burnell, the clergy had not been summoned. It was not that Edward, then in the thick of his Scotch and French wars, summoned barons, clergy, knights of the shire, and citizens, all to meet him, because that which touches all should be approved by all. But the complete form of Parliament was found to work so well that it was always summoned in that shape for the future. We may now turn to Edward's political doings. The affairs of Wales require the first notice. We have already mentioned in earlier chapters how the southern districts of that country had long ago passed, partly by conquest, partly by intermarriage with the families of native chiefs, into the hands of various Anglo-Norman barons. These nobles of the Welsh marchland, or lords marchers as they were called, had as their main duty the task of overawing and restraining the princes of North Wales, where Celtic anarchy still reigned supreme. Anglesea, the mountain lands of Snowdon, Meirioneth, and the valley of the Dee were the last home of the native Welsh. In this land of Gwynedd native princes still ruled and proved most unruly vassals to the English crown. Whenever England was vexed by civil war, the Welsh descended from their hills, PG 154 attacked the Lords Marchers and pushed their incursions into Cheshire and Shropshire. Sometimes they pushed even further afield. In 1257, they ravaged as far as Cardiff and Hereford. If it had not been that the princes of North Wales were even more given to murderous family feuds than to raids on the English border, they would have been an intolerable pest, but their interminable petty strife with each other generally kept them quiet. In 1272, the ruler of North Wales was Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, a bold and stirring prince, who had put down all his rebellious brothers and cousins and united the whole of Gwynedd under his sword. Following the example of his ancestors, Llewellyn had plunged with alacrity into the English civil wars of the time of Henry Roman III. He had allied himself with Simon de Montfort, and under cover of this alliance had made cruel ravages on the lands of the Lords Marchers in South Wales. He held out long after Simon fell PG 155 at Evesham, and only made peace in 1267 when he was admitted to very favourable terms and confirmed in the full possession of his principality. When Edward ascended his father's throne, he bade Llewellyn come to his court and do him homage, such as the ancient princes of Wales had been accustomed to offer. But he was met with repeated refusals. 6 times he summoned the Welshman to appear, and 6 times he was denied, for Llewellyn said that he would not leave his hills unless he was given as hostages the king's brother, Edmund of Lancaster, and the justiciar Ralph of Hengham. He feared for his life, he said, and would not trust himself in his suzerain's hands. Edward was not accustomed to have his word doubted, and being conscious of his own honest intentions, was bitterly angered at his vassal's distrust and contumacious answers. But the king's wrath reached its highest pitch in 1275, when he found that Llewellyn had put himself in communication with France, and sent to the French court for Eleanor de Montfort, Earl Simon's daughter, to take her to wife. The ship that carried the bride was captured off the Scilly Isles by a Bristol privateer, and she with her brother, Amory of Montfort, fell into Edward's hands. After Llewellyn had made one further refusal to do homage, Edward raised a great army and invaded Wales. The prince and his wild tribesmen took refuge in the fastnesses of Snowdon, but Edward blockaded all the outlets from the hills, and in a few months the Welsh were starved into submission. Llewellyn was forced to surrender himself into his suzerain's hands, but received better terms than might have been expected. He was made to do homage, and to give up the land between Conway and the Dee, the modern Shire of Denbigh, but was allowed to retain the rest of his dominions, and received his bride from Edward's hands. He was also reconciled to his brothers, whom he had long before driven away from Wales, and David, the eldest of these exiles, was given a great barony cut out of the ceded lands on the Dee, 1277. Though he had felt the weight of Edward's hand, the Prince of Wales was unwise enough to provoke his suzerain the second time. Finding that there was much discontent in the ceded districts of Wales, because the king was systematically substituting English laws and customs for the old Celtic usages, Llewellyn resolved to make a PG 156 sudden attempt to free them and to throw off his allegiance. His brother David joined in the plot, though he had always been protected by Edward and owed all that he possessed to English aid. On Palm Sunday, 1282, the two brothers secretly took arms without any declaration of war. David surprised Hawarden Castle, captured the Chief Justice of Wales, and slew the garrison, while Llewellyn swept the whole coastland as far as the gates of Chester with fire and sword. This treacherous and unprovoked rebellion deeply angered the king. He swore that he would make an end of the troublesome principality, and raised an army and a fleet greater than any that had ever been sent against the Welsh. After some slight engagements, the English once more drove Llewellyn and his host into the crags of Snowdon. Convinced of his folly, the prince sent to ask for peace, but Edward would not again grant the easy terms that he had given in 1277. Llewellyn should become an English earl, he said, and be granted lands worth £1,000 a year, but the independent principality of North Wales had been tried and found wanting. It should be abolished and annexed to England. Llewellyn, though in the sore straits, refused these terms. By a dangerous night march, he slipped through the English lines with a few chosen followers, and hastened into mid-Wales to stir up rebellion in Brecknock. But near Builth he fell in with a small party of English, and was slain in the skirmish which followed by an esquire named Adam of Frankton, who knew not with whom he was fighting. David, his brother, now proclaimed himself Prince of Wales, and held out in Snowdon for some months longer. But he was ultimately betrayed to the king by his own starving followers. He was taken over the border to be tried before the English Parliament, which met at Acton Burnell, just outside the walls of Shrewsbury. There was far more dislike felt for him than for his brother. Llewellyn had always been an open enemy, but David had long served at the English court, and had been granted his barony by Edward's special favour. Hence it came that the Parliament passed the death sentence for treason on the last Prince of Wales, and he was executed at Shrewsbury, with all the horrid details of hanging, drawing, and quartering, which were the traitor's lot in PG 157 those days. The harshness of his punishment almost makes us forget the provocation that he had given the king. Mercy for traitors was not characteristic of Edward's temper. 1283. Edward stayed for nearly 2 years in Wales after the fighting had ended. He devoted himself to reorganizing the principality on the English model. Llewellyn's dominions were cut up into the new counties of Anglesea, Meirioneth, and Carnarvon. Strong castles were built at Conway, Beaumaris, Carnarvon, and Harlech to hold them down, and colonies of English were tempted by liberal grants and charters to settle in the towns, which grew up at points suitable for centres of commerce. For the future governance of the land, Edward drew up the Statute of Wales, issued at Rhuddlan in 1284. He allowed a certain amount of the old Celtic customary law to survive, but introduced English legal usages to a much larger extent. The Welsh murmured bitterly against the new customs, but found them in the end a great improvement. Edward endeavoured to solace their discontent by placing many of the administrative posts in Welsh hands, and their national pride by reviving the ancient name of the principality. For in 1301 he gave his heir Edward, who had been born at Carnarvon, the title of Prince of Wales, solemnly invested him with the rule of the principality at a great meeting of all the Welsh chiefs, and set him to govern the land. Later kings of England have followed the custom, and the title of Prince of Wales has become stereotyped as that of the heir to the English crown. It must not be supposed that Wales settled down easily and without friction beneath Edward's sceptre. There were 3 or 4 risings against his authority, headed by chiefs who thought that they had some claim to inherit the old principality. One of these insurrections was a really formidable affair. In 1294, Madoc, the son of Llewellyn, raised half North Wales to follow him, beat the Earl of Lincoln in open battle, and ravaged the English border. The king himself, though sorely vexed at the moment by wars in Gascony and Scotland, marched against him at midwinter, but had to retire, foiled by the snows and torrents of the Welsh mountains. But next spring, Madoc was pursued and captured, and sent to spend the rest of his life as a captive in the Tower of London, 1295. For a few years after the annexation of Wales, the annals of PG 158 England are comparatively uneventful. Some of Edward's legislation, with which we have already dealt, falls into this period, but the king's attention was mainly taken up with foreign politics, into which he was drawn by his position as Duke of Aquitaine. He spent some time in Guienne, succeeded by careful diplomacy in keeping out of the wars between France and Aragon, which were raging near him, and introduced a measure of good government among his Gascon subjects. But more important events nearer home were soon to attract his attention. In 1286 perished Alexander Roman III, King of Scotland, cast over the cliffs of Kinghorn by the leap of an unruly horse. He was the last male of the old royal house that descended from Malcolm Canmore and the sainted Queen Margaret. 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, had been born to him, but they had all died young, and his only living descendant was his daughter's daughter, a child of 4 years. Her mother had wedded Eric, King of Norway, and it was at the Norwegian court that the little heiress was living when her grandfather died. Though Scotland had never before obeyed a queen regnant, her nobles made no difficulty in accepting the child Margaret, the Maid of Norway, as they called her, for their sovereign. A regency was appointed in her name, and the whole nation accepted her sway. Now Edward of England saw, in the accession of a young girl to the Scottish throne, a unique opportunity for bringing about a closer union of England and Scotland. There was no rational objection to the scheme. A century had elapsed since the 2 countries had been at war. Their baronages had become united by constant intermarriage. The Lowlands, the more important half of the Scotch realm, were English in speech and manners. Most important of all, there were as yet few or no national grudges between the races on either bank of the Tweed. Of the rancorous hostility which was to divide them in the next century, no man had any presage. When the little Queen of Scotland had reached her 7th year, the king proposed to the Scots regents that she should be married to his own son and heir, Edward of Carnarvon. He pledged himself that the kingdoms should not be forcibly united. PG 159 Scotland should keep all its laws and liberties and be administered by Scots alone, without any interference from England. The regents did not mislike the scheme. They summoned the Parliament of the Northern Realm to meet at Brigham-on-Tweed, and their Edward's offers were accepted and ratified with the consent of the whole realm, July 1290. The next step was to send to Norway for the young queen, for she had been living at her father's court till now and had never visited her own kingdom. She set sail for Scotland in the autumn of the year 1290, but adverse winds kept her vessel tossed for weeks in the wild North Sea. The strain was too much for the frail child. When at last she came ashore at Kirkwall in the Orkneys, it was only to die. With her life ended the fairest opportunity of uniting the two realms on equal terms that had ever been known. Edward's scheme had fallen through, and his grief was great, but much greater was the dismay in Scotland, where the regents found themselves face to face with the calamity of the extinction of the whole royal house. There was no longer any king or queen in whose name the law of the realm could run, or the simplest duties of government be discharged. Gradually, claimants for the crown began to step forward, basing their demands on ancient alliances with the old kingly line, but the nearest of these connections went back more than 100 years, to female descendants of King David, who had died in 1153. In this strait, the Scots determined to appeal to King Edward as arbitrator between the pretenders, whose rivalry seemed likely to split the kingdom up into a group of disorderly feudal principalities. Edward readily consented, seeing that in the capacity of arbitrator, he could find an opportunity of making more real the old English right of suzerainty over the Kingdom of Scotland. It will be remembered that as far back as the 10th century, the kings of the Scots had done homage to Edward the Elder, and that they held the more important half of their realm, Lothian and Strathclyde, which together form the Lowlands, as grants under feudal obligations from the English crown. But the exact degree of dependence of Scotland on England had never been accurately fixed, though Scottish kings had often sat in English parliaments and sometimes served in the English armies. It might be pleaded by a PG 160 patriotic Scot that as Earl of Lothian, his king had certain obligations to the English sovereign, but that for his lands north of the Forth and Clyde, he was liable to no such duties. This depended on the nature of the discharge given by Richard I to William the Lion in 1190, when he sold the Scottish king a release of certain duties of homage in return for the sum of 10,000 marks. But the agreement of Richard and William had been drawn up in such an unbusinesslike manner that no one could say exactly what it covered. King Edward was determined to put an end to this uncertainty, and, as a preliminary to accepting the post of arbitrator in the Scottish succession dispute, required that the regents and all the nobles of the northern realm should acknowledge his complete suzerainty over the whole kingdom. After some hesitation, they consented. Edward made a tour through Edinburgh, Stirling, and St. Andrews, and there received the homage of the whole nobility of Scotland. He then appointed a court of arbitration to sit at Berwick and adjudicate on the rights of the 13 claimants to the crown. It consisted of 80 Scots and 24 Englishmen. The court found that of serious claims to the crown there were only two, those of John Balliol and Robert Bruce, each of whom descended in the female line from the old King David I, who had died in 1153. The positions of Balliol and Bruce were closely similar. They were descended from two Anglo-Norman barons of the North Country, who had married two sisters, Margaret and Isabella, the great-granddaughters of David I. Both of them were as much English as Scotch in blood and breeding. Balliol was lord of Barnard Castle in Durham. Bruce had been Sheriff of Cumberland and had long served King Edward as Chief Justice of the King's Bench. Like so many of the Scottish barons, they were equally at home on either side of the border. The point of difficulty to decide between them was that, while Balliol descended from the elder of the two co-heiresses, Bruce was a generation nearer to the parent stem and claimed to have a preference on this account by Scottish usage. The Scottish succession in 1292. The Court of Arbitration decided that this plea of Bruce's was unsound and that his rival's right was undoubted. Edward PG 162 therefore decided in favor of Balliol, who straightway did him homage as King of all Scotland and was duly crowned at Scone, 1292. So far the King of England's conduct had been unexceptionable. He had acted as an honest umpire and had handed over the disputed realms to the rightful heir. But Edward's legal mind saw further consequences in the acknowledgement of allegiance which Balliol had made. This soon became evident when he began to allow persons who had been defeated in the Scottish law courts to appeal for a further decision to those of England, in virtue of the suzerainty of the latter country. Such a claim was valid in feudal law, and Edward, as Duke of Aquitaine, had often seen his Gascon subjects make an appeal from the courts of Bordeaux to those of Paris. But to the Scots, the idea was new, for no such custom had prevailed between England and Scotland, and they complained that Edward was breaking the promise which he had made at the time of the arbitration, to respect all the old privileges of the Scotch crown. In this they were practically right, for ancient usage was on their side. Balliol was a weak man and might have yielded to Edward's demand, but his barons refused to hear of it and bound him to do nothing save with the consent of a council of 12 advisers who were to determine his course of action. The discontent of the Scots was soon to have most deplorable consequences for both realms. At this time, Edward was just becoming involved in a bitter quarrel with Philip the Fair, the young king of France. Philip coveted Aquitaine and was determined to have it. He picked a quarrel with the King of England about the piratical doings of certain English seamen in the Channel. The mariners of the Cinque Ports and of Normandy had long been sworn foes. They fought whenever they met, without any concern as to whether England and France were at war or not. In 1293, there was a regular pitched battle between them off St. Mahe in Brittany. The Normans had the worse, and many of them were slain. This affray seemed to King Philip an admirable excuse for attacking his neighbor. He summoned Edward to Paris as Duke of Aquitaine to answer before his feudal lord for the misdoings of the English seamen. The King of England was not averse to PG 163 giving satisfaction, and sent to offer to submit to an arbitration in which the damages done by his subjects should be assessed. But Philip was not seeking damages, but an excuse for war. He at once declared Edward contumacious for not appearing in person, and proclaimed the forfeiture of the whole Duchy of Aquitaine. Hardly realizing the French king's intentions, Edward dispatched his brother Edmund, Earl of Lancaster, to endeavor to satisfy his offended suzerain. Philip then declared that he would consider himself satisfied if Edward surrendered into his hand, as a token of submission, the chief fortresses of Gascony. They should be restored the moment that compensation had been made for the doings at St. Mahe. Earl Edmund accepted the offer, and the castles were duly placed in Philip's hands. Then, with a barefaced effrontery that disgusted even his own nobles, the French king repudiated the agreement and declared that he should retain Guyenne permanently. Edward was thus committed to an unexpected war, while all his strongholds in Aquitaine were already in the enemy's hands. He began to arm in great wrath and sent ambassadors abroad to gather allies among Philip's continental foes, chief of whom were the Emperor Adolf of Nassau and the Counts of Brabant, Holland, and Flanders. But Philip also had looked about him for allies. At this moment, Madog ap Llywelyn rose in rebellion in North Wales, relying on French aid, and what was of far greater importance, the discontent of the Scots took the form of open war with England. John Balliol embraced the French alliance, promised to wed his son to Philip's daughter, and sent raiding bands across the border to harry Cumberland and Northumberland. Edward resolved at once to ward off the nearer dangers before taking in hand the reconquest of Guyenne. How he put down the dangerous rebellion of Madog the Welshman we have related in an earlier page. That campaign had taken up the best part of the year 1295. In the next spring, the turn of Balliol came. He was summoned to appear before his suzerain at Newcastle, and when he did not obey, Edward crossed the Tweed with a great host. Berwick, the frontier fortress and chief port of Scotland, was stormed after a very short siege, and 3 weeks later, the PG 164 Scottish king was completely routed at the Battle of Dunbar, April 1296. So unskillfully did the Scots fight that they were beaten by Edward's vanguard under John de Warenne, the hero of the rusty sword, at the Quo Warranto inquest, before the king and the main body of the English army came upon the field. One after another, Edinburgh, Perth, Stirling, and all the chief towns of Scotland yielded themselves, and ere long the craven-spirited King of the North surrendered himself and gave up his crown into Edward's hands, asking pardon as one who had been misled and coerced by evil counsellors. Edward then held a parliament of all the Scottish barons and received their homage, being resolved to reign himself as King north as well as south of the Tweed. He told the assembled nobles that none of the old laws of Scotland should be changed, and issued an amnesty to Balliol's late partisans. It seemed that all resistance was at an end, and that the union of the crowns was to take place with no further trouble or bloodshed. John de Warenne, the victor of Dunbar, was appointed guardian of the realm, and Edward turned southward in triumph, taking with him the Scottish regalia and the holy stone of Scone, on which the kings of Scotland were wont to be crowned. That famous relic still remains at Westminster, where Edward placed it, and serves as the pedestal of the coronation chair of the kings of England to this day. The king thought that Scotland was tamed even as Wales had been, forgetting that the Scots had hardly tried their strength against him, and had yielded so easily mainly because their craven king had deserted them. Dismissing northern affairs from his mind, he now turned to the long-deferred expedition to Guienne. The greater part of that duchy was still in King Philip's greedy hands, and only Bayonne and a few other towns were holding out against him. Edward determined to land in Flanders himself, and there to stir up his German allies against France, but to send the great bulk of the English levies to Gascony under the Marshal Roger Bigod, Earl of Norfolk. But the expedition was not to take place without much preliminary trouble and difficulty. Edward was in grave need of money to furnish forth his great army, and tried to levy new taxes without any formal grants from Parliament. This, at PG 165, once brought him into conflict with the clergy and the baronage. The arrogant Pope Boniface VIII had just published a bull named Clericis Lacos. From its opening words, it forbade the clergy to pay any taxes to the crown from their ecclesiastical revenues. Archbishop Winchelsea thought himself bound to carry out the Pope's command, and refused, in the name of all his order, to assent to any portion of the national taxation falling on church land. The king, who was in no mood to stand objections, was moved to great wrath at this unreasonable claim. He copied the behavior of his grandfather, King John, in a similar crisis, and by his behest, the judges proclaimed that no cleric should have law in the king's courts till the refusal to pay taxes was rescinded. Edward himself sequestrated the lands of the See of Canterbury, and intimated to all tenants on the estates of the clergy that nothing should be done against them if they refused to pay their rents. Many ecclesiastics thereupon withdrew their refusal to contribute to the national expenses, but the archbishop held out, and the quarrel ran on for some time. At last Boniface VIII was induced to so far modify his bull as to admit that the church might make voluntary grants for the purpose of national defense. Winchelsea therefore promised the king that he would endeavor to induce the clergy to make large contributions of their own free will, if Edward on his side would confirm the Great Charter and swear to take no further measures against church property. To this offer, Edward could not refuse his consent. He was in urgent need of money, and although it was a bad precedent to allow the clergy to assess their own taxation outside Parliament, and on a different scale from the contributions of the rest of the realm, he accepted Winchelsea's compromise. But this struggle of the king and the church was but one important episode of a contention between the king and the whole nation, which filled the years 1296-7. Edward had provoked the barons and the merchants of England no less than the clergy, the former by bidding them sail for Gascony in the winter and pay him a heavy tax, the latter by seizing all their wool, England's greatest export, as it lay in harbour, and forcing them to pay a heavy fine, the maltolte, or evil tax, as PG 166 it was called, before he would let it be sent oversea. All this had been done without the consent of Parliament. The barons, headed by Roger Bigod, who had been told off to head the expedition to Guienne, refused to go abroad unless the king himself should lead them, urging that their feudal duty was only to defend the kingdom and not to wage wars beyond it. Bigod flatly refused to set out unless the king went with him. "By God, Sir Earl, thou shalt either go or hang," exclaimed Edward, irritated at the contumacy of one who, as Marshal of England, was bound to hold the most responsible post in the army that he was striving to raise. "And by God, Sir King, I will neither go nor hang," shouted the equally enraged Earl Marshal. He flung himself out of the king's presence, and with the aid of his friend Bohun, the Earl of Hereford, gathered a great host, and prepared to withstand the king if he should persist in endeavoring to carry out his design. Edward, however, sailed himself for the continent without forcing the barons to follow him. When he was gone, a parliament met. Archbishop Winchelsea and the Earls of Norfolk and Hereford took the lead in protesting against the king's late arbitrary action, and by their counsel, a recapitulation of the Great Charter was drawn up, with certain articles added at the end, which expressly stipulated that the king should never raise any tax or impost without the consent of lords and commons in Parliament assembled, so that such an exaction as the late maltoled would be in future illegal. The document, which is generally known as the Confirmatio Cartarum, was sent oversea to the king. He received it at Ghent, and after much doubting signed it, for he always wished to have the goodwill of the nation, and knew that a persistence in the exercise of his royal prerogative would bring on a rebellion such as that which had overturned his father in 1263. From this moment dates the first practical control of the Parliament over the royal revenue, for the clause in Magna Carta which stipulates for such a right had been so often violated both by Henry III and his son that it required to be fully vindicated by the Confirmatio Cartarum before it was recognized as binding both by king and people. Meanwhile, Edward got little aid in Flanders from his German allies and found that he had small chance of punishing King PG 167 Philip by their arms. He saw Bruges and Lille taken by the French, and finally returned foiled to England, called thither by evil news from the north. Scotland was once more up in arms, though the Anglo-Norman lords who formed the bulk of the baronage had readily done homage to the English monarch. The mass of the nation were far less satisfied with the new condition of affairs. They felt that their king and nobles had betrayed them to the foreigner, for to many of them, notably the Highlanders, the Galloway men, and the Welsh of Strathclyde, the Englishmen still seemed foreign. Edward had not made a very wise choice in the ministers whom he left behind in Scotland. Ormesby, the Chief Justice, and Cressingham, the Treasurer, both made themselves hated by their harsh and unbending persistence in endeavoring to introduce English laws and English taxes. In the spring of 1297, an insurrection broke out in the West Lowlands, headed by a Strathclyde knight named William Wallace, or Le Wallies, i.e. the Welshman. He had been wronged by the Sheriff of Lanark, took to the hills, and was outlawed. His small band of followers soon swelled to a multitude, and the regent, John de Warenne, was obliged to march against him in person. Despising the tumultuary array of the rebels, who got no real help from the self-seeking barons of Scotland, the Earl marched carelessly out of Stirling to attack Wallace, who lay on the hill across the river beyond Cambuskenneth Bridge. Instead of waiting to be attacked, Wallace charged when a third of the English host had crossed the stream. This vanguard was overwhelmed and driven into the Forth, while de Warenne could not bring up his reserves across the crowded bridge. He withdrew into Stirling, leaving several thousand dead on the field, among them the hated Treasurer Cressingham, out of whose skin the victorious Scots are said to have cut straps and belts. This unexpected victory caused a general rising. Some of the barons and many of the gentry joined the insurgents. Wallace, Andrew Murray, and the Seneschal of Scotland were proclaimed wardens of the realm in behalf of the absent John Balliol, and their authority was generally acknowledged. Warenne could do nothing against them, and prayed his master Page 168 to come oversea to his help. Meanwhile, Wallace crossed the Tweed at the head of a great band of marauders, and harried Northumberland with a wanton cruelty which was to lead to bitter reprisals later on. It was not that Edward returned to England and took in hand the suppression of the rebellion. He crossed the border with the whole feudal levy of England, 20,000 bowmen, and a great horde of Welsh light infantry. Soon, he was joined by many Scots of the English faction. Wallace burnt the Lothians behind him and retired northward for some time without fighting. Edward's great host was almost forced to retire for want of provisions, but when the news was brought him that Wallace had pitched his camp at Falkirk, he pressed on to bring the Scots to action. He found them drawn up behind a morass, formed in 4 great clumps of pikemen, with archers in the intervals and a few cavalry in the reserve. The first charge of the English horse was checked by the bog. The second was beaten back by the steady infantry of the Scots. Then Edward brought forward his archers and bade them riddle the heavy masses of the enemy with ceaseless arrow flights till a gap was made. Then the English horse charged again. The Scottish knights in reserve fled without attempting to save the day, and the greater part of the squares of pikemen were ridden down and cut to pieces. Wallace fled to the hills, and the English cruelly ravaged all the lowlands. But the Scots did not yet submit. The barons deposed Wallace, of whom they had always been jealous, and named a regency to supersede him under John Comyn, the nephew of their exiled king. The struggle lingered on for several years more, for Edward was hindered from completing his work by the continual pressure of the French war. It was not T2 that he resumed and finished the conquest of the lowlands, but in 1303 he was at length able to make a definitive peace with Philip Roman IV, who restored to him all the lost fortresses of Guienne. Free at last from his continental troubles, Edward swept over Scotland from end to end, carrying his arms into the north as far as Elgin and Banff. The regent Comyn and all the barons of the land submitted to him, and by the capture of Stirling in 1304, the last embers of resistance were quenched. Scotland was apparently crushed. The king reorganized the whole country, cutting it up into counties and sheriffdoms like England, providing for its representation in the English Parliament, and setting up new judges and governors throughout the land. The administration was, for the most part, left in the hands of Scots, though the king's nephew, John of Brittany, was appointed regent and warden of the land. The last hope of the survival of Scottish independence seemed to vanish in 1305, when Wallace, who had maintained himself as an outlaw in the hills long after the rest of his countrymen had submitted, fell into the hands of the English. He was betrayed by some of his own men to Sir John Menteith, one of Edward's Scottish officials. Menteith sent him to London, where he was executed as a traitor, with all the cruelties that were prescribed for men guilty of high treason. It would have been better for the king's good name if he, like so many other Scots, had been pardoned, but Edward could not forgive the prime mover of the insurrection and the cruel waster of the English border. For some 2 years, Scotland was governed as part of Edward's realm, but the nation submitted from sheer necessity, not from any good will. In 1306, the troubles broke out again, owing to the ambition of a single man. Robert Bruce, the grandson of the Bruce who had striven with Balliol in 1292, was the leader in the new rising. Like his grandfather, he was more of an English baron than a pure Scot. He had taken Edward's side in the civil wars, and seems to have hoped that his fidelity might be rewarded by the gift of the Scottish crown when the Balliols were finally dismissed. Receiving no such guerdon, he conspired with some of his kinsfolk and a few of the Scottish earls, and endeavoured to get John Comyn, the late regent of Scotland, to join him. But when Comyn refused, at an interview in the Greyfriars Kirk at Dumfries, to break his newly sworn faith to King Edward, Bruce slew him with his own hand before the altar and fled to the north. There was method in this murder, for after the Balliols, Comyn had the best hereditary claim to the Scottish throne. Gathering his followers at Scone, Bruce had himself crowned PG 170 King of Scotland. But his royalty was of the most ephemeral nature. Few of the Scots would join one whose past record was so unsatisfactory, and his army was beaten and dispersed by De Valence, Earl of Pembroke, whom King Edward sent against him. Bruce had to take to the hills almost alone, and for many months was chased about the woods and lochs of Perthshire and Argyllshire by Highland chiefs eager to earn the price that Edward had set upon his head. His kinsmen, Nigel, Alexander, and Thomas, with most of his chief followers, were captured, tried, and executed, for Edward was driven to wild anger by the unprovoked rising of one who had hitherto been his hot partisan. Even the ladies of Bruce's house were cast into dungeons, and the Countess of Buchan, who had crowned him at Scone, was shut up in an iron cage. The king's hand fell far more heavily on Scotland than before. The lands of Bruce's partisans were confiscated and given to Englishmen, and all who had favoured him were slain or outlawed. Unhappily for the king, these harsh measures had a very different result from that which he had expected. The hangings and confiscations gave Bruce many new partisans, and his misfortunes made him the nation's favourite. When he left his island refuge in Argyllshire in the spring of 1307 and landed in Carrick, he was joined by a considerable force. Edward, though now an old man and stricken down by disease, swore that he would make an end of the traitor. He mounted his horse for the last time at Carlisle and rode as far as Burgh-on-Sands, where bodily weakness forced him to stop. Feeling the hand of death upon him, he made his son Edward of Carnarvon swear to persevere in the expedition against Bruce. He even bade him bear his coffin forward into Scotland, for his very bones, he said, would make the Scots quake. 4 days of illness ended his laborious life. July 17, 1307. His unworthy son at once broke up the army, leaving Bruce to make head unopposed, and used his father's funeral as an excuse for returning home. Edward was buried under a plain marble slab at Westminster, with the short inscription: EDWRDVS, PRIMVS, MALLEVS, SCOTRVM, HIC EST, PACTVM, SCRVA.